Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf mem hey. This is the daf for Shabbat, and the daf for Tisha B'av will go up right after this. And it's a very short daf, so you should be able to have time, hopefully today, to get them both in before Tisha B'av, if it works for you. Okay, let's get started. The Mishnah at the top of our daf starts off, Hagoyim ha'ovdim et ha'arim be'et ha'gvaot. Hey mutarin u'mash alehem asurim. If you have Gentiles, and this doesn't only mean Gentiles, this could even be Jews, who decided they're going to worship the mountains or the hills. The mountains and the hills are actually permitted, and only what's on them is forbidden. Meaning, if they have idols that they're worshiping that are on the mountains, those will be forbidden, or on the hills. But not the hills and the mountains themselves. Shenema, where do we get this from? Lo tachmod kesef v'zahav alehem. Okay, this pasuk is a pasuk. We're going to see the pasukim both in Dvarim chapter 7 and Dvarim chapter 12, which talk about coming into the land and getting rid of the idols. So there it says, Psilei Elohehen tisrafun ba'esh. Burn the psilim in fire. That means you can't benefit from them. Lo tachmod kesef v'zahav alehem. Don't desire the kesef and zahav that are on them. Okay. Now what we mean is these are idols that are made out of kesef and zahav, and it's not right that the land, right, and the mountains, someone could turn those into idols, but those aren't idols. Now there's a big question here among the Rishonim. Does this mean they're not idols at all? If somebody worships a mountain, that's not considered they're worshiping it like an idol? Some people say, no, it's not. Okay? That isn't an idol. And therefore, again, they're mutar. There's no, what the issue in our Mishnah is talking about is, are they forbidden to benefit from? So some people think it means they're not even idols, and therefore it's permitted to benefit from them. Some people say, no. These, what it really means in the Mishnah is, they are idols. Someone could turn the mountain into an idol. However, even though the mountain is an idol, it's still not going to be permitted to benefit from, because that's something too big to start forbidding to benefit from a mountain, right? Those are not the kind of things that you could forbid to get benefit from. Items are forbidden to get benefit from, movable things, but not things attached to the ground. So either which way we have this, okay, however we understand it, for sure it's permitted to benefit from. That's what it's telling us. And only if you have an idol on them will they be forbidden. Okay, which it says, Lo tachmod kesef v'zahav alehem, on them, on those mountains, on those hills. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer. Now he's going to say the same thing. He's just going to prove from a different pasuk, and the Gemara is going to say, what's the difference between them? Because who cares whether you learn from this pasuk or that pasuk? So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Elohem al ha'arim v'lo ha'arim Elohem. He quotes a different pasuk, as I mentioned before. We're going to see. The first pasuk was Dvarim chapter 7. This is Dvarim chapter Yubet 12. Here it says in verse 2, Abei ta'abdun et kol ha'mekamot asher avdu sham, agoyim. Get rid of all the places where they worship. Asher atem yorshim otam, that you're going to inherit. Et Elohem al ha'arim, haramim. They're gods that are on the high mountains. V'al agvaot, and on the hills. B'tacha kol eitz ra'anan, and under all the trees. So now they're going to say this. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, notice the pasuk says, they are gods that are on the mountains or on the hills, but not that the mountains are gods. I actually saw this quoted earlier in the Gemara, a few Masechtot ago, I don't remember when. This comes up in other places, probably Sanhedrin. Elohem al-harim, but not ha'arim Elohem. The mountains themselves are not gods. Elohem al-agvaot. The gods on, right, the idols on the hills, v'lo hagvaot Elohem, but the hills themselves, you can see from this pasuk, are not the gods themselves. Now, we have a question that according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, umipnei ma ashera asura. But then why is the Asherah tree? Because notice the end of that pasuk, it says, and under every tree, which means under the tree and not the tree itself. But we have Asherah trees, which are idols, and they have to be destroyed. And we know that because we're going to see a bunch of psukim today that said you have to burn them. So they answer, Mipnei sheyesh batfi, and as Rabbi Yossi Aglili answers, Mipnei sheyesh batfisat yidei adam. Because there's human involvement in creating that tree. It's not like a mountain or a hill that's created without human involvement. This has human involvement. Because it has human involvement, therefore, it's going to be forbidden. Now this next line is really unnecessary, and we're going to darshan it later. And anything that has human involvement is forbidden. Now we already got that, because why is the Asherah forbidden? Because there's human involvement. And now they're just giving the rule, which is anything that has human involvement is forbidden. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva now continues and says, and he takes over, and he says, Ani ovim va'adun lefanecha. I'm going to explain that earlier. I'm going to explain the pasuk better now. Okay, the pasuk that Rabbi Yossi Aglili quoted, I'm going to make it clear to you. Ovin from Lashon lahavin, to understand. Va'adun, and I'm going to judge it before you. But judge it means really explain it. Kol makom she'ata motzei har gavoa v'givani sa'a ve'etz ha'anan da sheyesh sham avodah zarah. That pasuk is really coming to tell the people, Moshe is telling the people, when you get to the land, look up on the mountains, look under the trees. That's where you're going to find the idols. It's kind of an indicator. Right? These are indicators where you're going to find them when you get into the land. Not necessarily saying what's permitted, what's not. Okay? So he says that really is coming just to tell people how you're going to find them. Okay, so now the Gemara asks the question I said they were going to ask, which is, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Hanu Tanakama. What's the difference if you learn it from Lo Tachmod Kesef Zahav Elohem or Elohem El Ha'arim V'Lo Ha'arim Elohem? So we're going to have two answers for this question. The first is Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama Amar Rish Lakish. He says in the name of Rish Lakish, Tzipoi har kehar ikabenayu. If you cover the mountain with gold or silver, that's the machloket. Tanakama Saval, Tzipoi har eno kehal umitzah. Tanakama says if you cover the mountain with gold and silver, and say this is a god, it's right, and then you bow down. Now, this is a good question. There's a machloket among the Rishonim whether we're talking about, and then you bow to the covering, the gold and silver, or you bow to the mountain. Okay, it could be that, it could be that. We don't know. Machloket between the Rishonim about how to understand this, but let's just go with the general idea. So the rabbis say, the first opinion in the Mishnah, the Tanakama, Tzipoi har is not like the mountain. So, umitzar is going to be forbidden. That's why he said, Lo tachmod kesef zahav alehem, on it, even if it's just covering it. Not necessarily an idol standing on it, but just gold and silver covering. So again, it could be, what they're saying is, if you worship the covering, it's an idol, or maybe even if you worship the mountain, but since it has a covering on it, that's considered on the mountain, and it will be forbidden. No, that's still considered part of the mountain. When we say on the mountain, there are gods on the mountain, we don't mean some gold and silver covering the mountain. We mean an idol, something standing on the ground or put on the ground, but not just a covering. Covering is considered secondary to the mountain, which means if the mountain's not forbidden, then the covering is not forbidden. And therefore, again, two opinions of the Rishonim of how to understand this. Either if you're worshiping the mountain itself, well, the covering is batel and not considered important. Or maybe it even means even if you're worshiping the cover, it's still that cover is considered really just part of the mountain, and therefore it's not forbidden. That's answer number one. Rav Sheshet says, no, that's not the reason, the difference. He thinks, nobody thinks that the covering is not like the mountain. Covering, it's like it's separate from the mountain, and it would be considered forbidden. Okay? Everyone thinks it's not like the mountain. If there's gold and silver covering the mountain, you'll be liable. Whether you're praying to the mountain and it's the cover of it, or whether you're praying to the cover, again, machloket rishonim. Okay, but now what's the machloket? And here we get to Amud Bet already. It's a very short daf, which is good because you have a lot of dafim to catch up on for this weekend. The machloket is about, what if you had a tree? Now the machloket is going to be about Asherah trees. You planted the tree just as a tree, and then you decided to worship the tree. So now, here's the machloket. Tanakama Saval, Ilan Shenita'o Levasof Avdo Mutal. If you first planted it, and it wasn't planted for the sake of an Asherah tree, or Avodah Zarah, then, and you decide later to worship it, that's going to be permitted. Okay? That's not forbidden because the tree was attached to the ground as something permitted, and therefore, it's going to be considered attached to the ground like the mountains and the hills. For Rabbi Yossi Aglili Safar, Ilan Shenita'o Levasof Avdo Asul. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, listen, any tree, right? Because remember, okay, we're going to see in a minute where he gets this from. As long as there's human involvement, remember that's what he said? So since you planted it, it doesn't matter that you planted it for heter purposes, for permissible purposes, and only later decide to worship it. It's going to be considered like a tree that, even though it's attached to the ground, it's considered an idol. Okay, and you're going to be forbidden to benefit from it. So again, Tanakama says, now everyone agrees that if the tree was planted to be an Asherah tree, for sure it's forbidden and it's forbidden to benefit from. That's why it says Ashrei entis fuvum be'esh. And we're going to get back to that. The machloket is about what if you didn't plant it to be an Asherah tree. You planted it to be a regular tree and then later decide to worship it as an Asherah tree. So now they say mimai. Where do we get that this is the machloket? And as Rav Sheshes is going to try to prove his opinion. Midikatane seifa. Because it says at the end there, mipnei ma asherah asura, mipnei sheyesh ba tfisat yad. Now remember, there was an unnecessary sentence there because it already said why is the Asherah forbidden? Because it has human involvement. Because sheyesh ba tfisat yidei adam asur. Right? So now, why do we have to add that extra line? Anything that has human involvement is going to be forbidden. What does that come to include? Does it not come to include this tree that was planted and later we decided to worship it? Okay, so that's how we learn. Now, what we're going to do now is, according to Rav Sheshet, the machloket between Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi Aglili is specifically about this tree that was planted for permitted purposes and then we decided to worship it later. Now we're going to say that Af Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Savar Ilan Sheneta'ol Levasof Avdo Asur. We're now going to see that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, not the same Rabbi Yossi Aglili, different Rabbi Yossi, held also like Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the way Rav Sheshet understood him, that a tree that was planted and later worshipped is actually forbidden and is not considered attached to the ground like the mountains and the hills. Ditan, how do we know this? Well, the Braita says, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mitoch Shenemar Elohem Alarim Velo Arim Elohem. Once it says that, right? We darsha the first two parts of that pasuk, the mountains, the hills. It's only things on the mountains, but not the mountains and the hills themselves. Shomeani, I would think to say, Tacha kol eitz ra'anan Elohem. Under every tree, also you'll find their gods. V'lo eitz ra'anan Elohem, and not that the tree is the god. So I would have thought that. However, there's a different pasuk which we haven't seen yet. Talmud Lomau. Okay, this is in Dvarim Yud Bet, the next pasuk after Abei Tabdun and the Elohim Ha'al Ha'arim and all that. Nitatztem mizbechotam, break their mizbechot. Shibartem et matzevotam, break their another word, their what do you say, matzeva? It's another word for mizbech, basically, their altars. Va'ashrehen tisrafum ba'esh, and burn their asheras in fire. So now he's going to say, oh, notice it says to burn the Asherah. So what does it come to teach you? Obviously, we have to burn the trees. And we assume he means the trees that were first planted to be regular trees, and then we started worshiping them. And then, okay, so now, he's left to it. So then we're going to say, you must hold like Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Now, Ela tacha kol eitz ra'anan lamali. So what do we do with the tacha kol eitz ra'anan, which would make it sound like only under the tree and not the tree itself? Well, that comes, we already explained that in the Mishnah, like Rabbi Akiva is going to say. Tamar Rabbi Akiva, ani ovim va'adun lefanecha. I'm going to explain this to you. Kol makom she'atam motzei har gavoa, b'givani sa'a, ve'etz ra'anan, da sheyesh sham avodah zarah. Right, when you get into the land, you see a tall mountain or a tall hill or a tree, you're going to know that underneath it is avodah zarah, or likely. You're going to find it there. Now we're going to start a ping pong between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and the rabbis. What are the rabbis going to do with that pasuk? They think that you don't burn trees that were planted for permitted purposes and only became avodah zarah later. Well, the obvious is, what are you going to say? So what asheras do you burn? Pretty clear. What are you going to have to burn? You're going to have to burn the ones that originally were planted as asherah trees, because from the beginning they were problematic. Those have to be burned. Okay, that makes sense. It makes so much sense that now they're going to go back to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and say, how could you say Ashrei Henchishfufum Be'esh is the ones that were planted permitted manner? Why don't you just say like the rabbis do, which is it was the ones that were planted to be Asherah trees? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, don't they need Ashrei Henchishfufum Be'esh to be talking about the basic law that a tree that was planted to be an Asherah tree, to be worshipped for idols, should be destroyed completely? So they say, Hachinami, you're right. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda really would learn that from Ashrei Henchishfufum Be'esh. So now we're back to square one. Where does he learn? Where does Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda learn that Ela Ilan Sheneta'ol Levasof Avdo Menale? Where does he get that a tree that was planted and later worshipped? Where does he get that from? Nafkalemi va'ashrehen tigadeum. He's going to get it from cut down the Asherah tree. Where's this pasuk? We keep going back and forth. This is in Dvarim Zayin, which was the first pasuk we started from. That was where we had to say you have to destroy the idols, and then it said Lo tachmod kesef zahav alehem. That was the first pasuk of Tanakama. Now it continues, the next pasuk says, Kim kotasu lahem, this is what you should do. Mizbochotem titotzu, matzevotam shaberu. Same words. Break their altars. Va'ashrehen tigadeun, upsilihen tisrafu ba'esh. Okay, they're idols, you should burn in fire, but the ashrehen you should cut. Now what happens when you cut a tree? You don't cut it from the roots. You cut it above the roots. So that's not the same as burning. Burning is from the roots. So now we're going to say, mibayale, so ashrehen, ilan shetol of safav dominale. Nafkalemi vashrehen tigadeun. That's where he learns it from. Ezu et shigidu o asur v'karon mutar. Where do you have a tree that the cut part is a problem, but the roots are not? It must be a tree that was planted with the proper intent, not to be idle, and only became an idol later. It must be this tree that you planted for permitted purposes, and then later became, right, you decided to worship it. So now they say, wait a minute. That all sounds good, except what? When we quoted Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda before, what did he say? What's his proof pasuk? Ashrehen tisrafun, not ashrehen tigadeun. So, v'ha'ashrehen tisrafun be'esh kanasiv latamuda. But the drasha he used was from ashrehen tisrafun be'esh. So, that doesn't make any sense what we just said. That his proof is ashrehen tigadeun. That's not what he said. Right? We're putting words in his mouth. They're not the words he said. So they say, no, it is. Because ilu lo ne'amar kamar. It's a structure of had it not said. Okay? We're going to explain what this is in a minute. Ilu lo ne'amar tisrafun be'esh hayiti omeo. If you hadn't had, there's two psukim. One says burn the Asherah. One says cut the Asherah. Now, if you just had cut the Asherah, what would you have thought? Right? Ilu lo ne'amar. If it hadn't said just rafun be'esh hayiti omeo, I would say ashrehen tigadeun be'ilan shenita'o mitchila lakach. Cut the tree is a tree that was planted to be an Asherah tree from the beginning. And it says, cut it down. But now that I have the second pasuk which says, burn it, we now have these two psukim. One must be one kind and one must be another kind. So we're left with Ashrehen Tigadeun must teach you Li'lan Shenita'o Levasof Avdo. So what is it telling you basically? Yes, Ashrehen Tigadeun is where we learn it from. But we only learn it because it also says Ashrehen Tisrafun Be'esh. If it just said Tigadeun, we would have said that comes from the basic one, for the one you planted as Avodah Zarah. Once we have two, we realize that Ashrehen Tisrafun is the one you planted originally, and Tigadeun is the one that you planted for permitted purposes, and then only have to cut it, but not uproot it from the roots. And that, so really in the end, it's learned from the fact that Ashrehen Tisrafun is a pasuk. If that pasuk hadn't existed, we wouldn't have come to this conclusion. Okay, but now we're going to keep going back to our ping pong. So Ashrehen Tigadeun, Rabbanan, Hay Ashrehen Tigadeun Ma'avdele. So the rabbis don't have this drasha of there's two types that are both forbidden. They only have one type that's forbidden. From that, they get Ashrehen Tisrafun. Burn the ones that were planted as Asherah trees. But what do we do with the one about that says cut off? L'chidi Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. He's going to learn from this to what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Gidu Avodah Zarah kodmim l'kibush Eretz Yisrael. Kibush Eretz Yisrael kodem l'biur Avodah Zarah. It's a great sugya. This is, when you have a bunch of things to do, you have to prioritize. And what were the priorities when they got into the land? So the first thing they did, Avodah Zarah kodmim l'kibush Eretz Yisrael. Before they conquered the land, they had to first break everything. That's where it says, Mizbechotem titotzu, v'nitatzem mizbechotam, shibartem et matzevotam, ashrehen, wrong pasuk. Sorry, go back. Dvarim zayin chet, or maybe et hey actually. Kim kotasu lahem mizbechotem titotzu, matzevotam tishaberu, ashrehen tigadun. Cut the trees, break the altars, make it impossible for them to continue worshiping idols. But then, don't yet destroy them. Abed Tabdun and all that is going to come later. First, Kibush Eretz Yisrael Kodem Lebiur Avodah Zarah. Then conquer the land. When you're done conquering the land, then go back and completely destroy and burn all the stuff. Okay? That's what the rabbis do, because the rabbis think Tisrafun is a later stage. And that happens with a break. First Tigadeun, then conquer the land, then Tisrafun. And that's how they understand it. Okay, so that's how, remember, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda needs Tigadeun to teach you. There's two types of trees, right? Tisrafun and Tigadeun, two different types. One needs burning, one needs cutting. Depends on whether it was planted for okay reasons or for Avodah Zarah purposes. The rabbis say no. Tigadeun means cut it down. That's stage one. After it's cut down and it's no longer able to be worshipped, conquer the land, and only after that burn it. Okay, this was all to teach you Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's position, right? That's what the rabbis fit in with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Well, now they're going to, and by the way, we're going to have further proof of this, how they get from here, I didn't read further enough. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is going to prove it, or the Gemara is going to prove it. Ditani Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef brings a brayta that says, V'nitatztem mizbechotam. This is the pasuk I quoted before. Okay, this is the one actually with the Ashrei Hentis Rafum Be'esh one. Okay, this is Yud Bet, pasuk Gimel. Nitatztem mizbechotam, v'hanach, and stop. Shibartem et matzevotam, v'hanach, and leave it. V'hanach. So now the Gemara says, hanach zachatach. How could you say and leave it? Shreifa bai. How could you say? The next words are burn it in fire, right? Ashrei Hentis Rafun. So Amar Rav Huna, ridof achar kach schof. First chase, right? And that's first chase the people, then burn it. In other words, from this pasuk we learn, break them and wait, break them and wait, and then, right, that's how we understood that brayta. What about burning it? Oh no, we do burn it, but that's only later. That's why we leave it until we conquer, and then we burn it. Now, the problem is, what is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda? Where's he going to learn this thing of Rabbi Shon? We assume he assumes also this is how it worked. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda is Svarim Anale. He doesn't have the Ashrei Hentigadeun to teach you this, because he thinks that means destroy it completely, right? In other words, those are the ones that were originally planted for the proper reason, but then became Avodah Zarah, and that's why we have it, not to teach you this. Well, Nafkalemi Abed Abdun. Okay, where does he learn it from? The double language of Abed Abdun. Abed va'achar kach ta'abdun. First destroy it, and then after you've conquered the land, completely destroy it. For Rabbanan. So what do the rabbis do with that? They don't need that pasuk for that. So what do they do with Abed Abdun? Again, we're continuing on this ping pong. Once you uproot the Avodah Zarah, you have to go find the roots of it and get it out completely. That's what the Ta'abdun, the double language, comes to teach you. Okay, what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda doesn't believe that, because he uses Abed Abdun for the fact that you have to wait in between. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, l'shavesh acharei Menali, where does he get that from? Nafkalemi v'ibadetem et shmam. Okay, this is the pasuk before. Nitatzem mizbechotam, shibartem matzevotam, ashrei hentis rafum be'esh, upsilei Elohem tigadeun, v'ibadetem et shmam min hamakoma hahu. And you will wipe out their name from that place. What did the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda learn? Wipe out their name means uproot it completely. So now they say, V'Rabbanan, what did they do with that? We're almost at the end here. That means you have to change its name. If they called it Asherah, call it something else. Okay, whatever the idol was called, give it a different name, and that will make sure the name gets wiped out forever. People won't call it that anymore. Tanya, where do we know this from? First, they're going to bring the proof of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that Ibad Temet Shmam is Lisharesh, get rid of the root. Right, get rid of it at the roots. How do you know the Sharesh Shachaveah? Tamalam Ibad Temet Shmam. But Amarlo Rabbi Akiva, and that's going to be the source for the rabbi's position. Halok Kfar Ne'amar Abed Abdun. I'm going a little bit into the next daf. Halok Kfar Ne'amar Abed Abdun in Kemata Malam Ibad Temet Shmam in Amakomahu. In other words, again, Rabbi Akiva says we already got that from Ibad Temet Shmam is to uproot, because that's the rabbi's position. What do we do with Ibad Temet Shmam? Lechanot Lashem. Ibad Temet Shmam, wipe out their name, means you have to change their name to something else. And that's our ping pong. Okay, so now this continues a little bit more into the next stop. Oh, we'll stop here. So what did we do here? Basically, we started with this machloket in the Mishnah which really wasn't so clear, which pasuk we learn it from, that the mountains and the hills are actually permitted to benefit from, even if people worship them. Okay, either because they're not idols at all or because they are idols, but they're not considered forbidden to benefit from because they're attached to the ground, and only movables would be forbidden. From there, we have two different psukim, and then basically we go back, we try to figure out in the Gemara, right? Then we have this additional thing about Rabbi Akiva and how he understood the pasuk under each tree and all that, and he understood the whole pasuk was really just telling the people where to find things and not the drasha we saw before. But we wanted to know what the difference between Rabbi Yosef Glili and the rabbis was. For that, we had two options. Rami Bar Chama said in the Rish Lakish, it's all about if the mountain is covered with gold or silver, is that going to be forbidden or not? And the second is, the second opinion we saw was Rav Sheshet, who said the machloket is about this ilan sheneta oel levasaf avdil, a tree that was first planted for permitted purposes and then later was used. Is that considered attached to the ground like the mountains? That's what the rabbis say. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, no, that's going to be forbidden also. And then we said Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda said the same thing. And then we had this ping pong back and forth, how Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and the rabbis each proved the different approaches from the different psukim. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a good fast. And may this bring about B'sorot Tovot for Am Yisrael.